Your memory isn't bad, you're just using it wrong. Most people walk around convinced they're forgetful or not wired for memorizing, but that's usually an excuse to avoid fixing the real problem: their habits, their attention, and the way they encode information. This guide isn't here to flatter you or tell you that you're naturally gifted. It's here to show you where you're slipping and exactly how to correct it. If you stick through the whole thing, you'll walk away with a sharper, faster, and more reliable mind than 90% of people. Let's get straight into it. Chapter 1. Understanding how memory actually works. Before you try to improve your memory, you need to drop the fantasy version of how memory works and deal with the real mechanics. Most people walk around thinking memory is some mysterious talent a lucky few are born with. That belief is a convenient excuse. It lets you avoid responsibility. The truth is much simpler and far less magical. Memory is a system built on predictable steps, and if any step is weak, the whole thing collapses. Your memory problems aren't fate. They're the logical result of how you use your brain day to day. Memory operates through 3 fundamental stages: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Miss one, and the information evaporates. The first step, encoding, is where most people fail without realizing it. Encoding is the process of turning an experience, fact, or idea into a form your brain can store. And here's the harsh truth: if you don't encode properly, the memory never existed in the first place. When you say, "I forgot," what usually happened is that you never truly registered the information. You heard words, but your mind wasn't engaged. You skimmed a page, but you didn't process anything. You watched a video, but your attention was split. Memory requires intention, and most people go through life on autopilot. Think about how you listen when someone tells you their name. You're not paying attention, you're self-conscious, distracted, or already thinking about what you're going to say next. Then a minute later, you're stuck pretending you didn't forget their name. That's not a memory issue. That's an encoding failure caused by shallow attention. Your brain can't store what you never bothered to absorb. Let's break this down with something obvious. When you touch a hot stove, do you ever forget that sensation? No. Why? Because your attention is fully locked in the moment. The stimulus is strong, the reaction is intense, and your brain instantly tags that information as important. In other words, the encoding phase is undeniable. Everyday information doesn't get the same treatment because you don't give it importance or attention. That's the difference, not intelligence, not talent, not genetics. Now let's move to the second step, storage. Once information is encoded, your brain decides where and how strongly to store it. It's not a perfect archive. It's closer to a survival-oriented filing system. The brain stores what it thinks matters and discards what seems irrelevant. And guess who decides what seems relevant? You do, through repetition, emotional significance, and focus. If you casually glance at something once, your brain labels it disposable. If you return to it again and again with intention, the brain promotes it into longer-term storage. This is why studying once never works, and why spacing out your review does. But again, storage only happens if encoding was strong in the first place. You can't store what you didn't capture. The final stage is retrieval, accessing the memory when you need it. People get hung up on retrieval because it's the most noticeable failure. You blank on a name. You can't recall what you studied last night. You forget a task someone mentioned earlier. You assume your memory is weak. In reality, retrieval issues usually point back to weak encoding or weak reinforcement. Your brain didn't get enough signals that the information mattered, so it didn't prioritize making it easily accessible. Strong memories feel effortless because the brain placed them in high-priority storage. Weak ones get buried. The retrieval system isn't broken. It's following the rules you set without realizing it. Here's the part most people never want to admit. Your modern lifestyle is perfectly designed to sabotage your memory. The constant notifications, endless scrolling, multitasking, binge-watching, rapid switching between apps, your attention is fractured into tiny, useless fragments. Your brain adapts to what you train it to do. If you feed it shallow, rapid, low-engagement information all day, why expect it to suddenly perform well when something important comes along? You've trained it to skim, not remember. Memory thrives under conditions your daily habits rarely allow. Focused attention, repetition, reflection, emotional connection, and mental effort. You can't improve memory while living in a distracted fog. You have to build the mental environment where memory can actually function. Another thing you need to understand is that memory isn't meant to store everything. Forgetting is not a flaw, it's a filtering mechanism. The brain deletes junk so it can focus on what matters. The problem is that you haven't trained your brain to recognize what matters. You treat everything with the same level of attention, which is to say, almost none. The brain responds by discarding almost everything. The moment you begin treating information with deliberate importance, paying attention on purpose, repeating what you just learned, connecting it to something meaningful, your memory responds instantly. It's not slow to adapt. It's been waiting for you to give it something to work with. There's another misconception worth killing. Memory is not a natural ability you either have or lack. A stronger memory is the result of stronger habits. Memory champions aren't superhuman. They're trained. They understand how the brain encodes and stores information, and they exploit that system aggressively. The only difference between them and you is strategy and effort. If you take nothing else from this chapter, take this. Memory is voluntary. It's not something that happens to you. It's something you build through attention, engagement, and intention. Every time you forget something simple, someone's name, where you put your keys, what you just read, it's not a sign that your brain is defective. It's feedback that you weren't paying attention or you didn't encode the information deeply enough. That may sound blunt, but it's empowering. If forgetfulness is caused by poor habits, then fixing those habits immediately improves your memory. Before you move to the next chapter, you need to accept a final truth. Your memory is already capable of far more than you give it credit for. You've just been using the system incorrectly. Once you stop drifting through information and start engaging with it deliberately, everything changes. Memory stops feeling random and starts feeling reliable. The techniques in the next chapters will work, but only if you approach them with the understanding you just learned. Memory isn't magic, it's mechanics. And mechanics can be mastered. Chapter 2. The Attention Fix. Let's be blunt. If you don't control your attention, you will never have a good memory. Period. People love blaming their brain, age, stress, or some imaginary bad memory gene, but the real problem is much simpler and far more uncomfortable. You're chronically distracted, and you've trained your mind to process everything at a shallow level. Memory cannot form in a distracted mind. Attention is the gateway, the front door, the mandatory first step. If that door is barely open, nothing gets through. This chapter is about ripping away the excuses and showing you how brutally important attention really is. You don't need a higher IQ, better genetics, or some magical supplement. You need to stop scattering your attention like confetti and start giving your brain the focus it needs to do its job. Here's the first hard truth. Multitasking is a lie. You're not multitasking. You're fast switching between tasks, and every time you switch, your brain resets its focus. That resetting destroys memory formation. When you try to read while checking texts, flipping between tabs, or half listening to something in the background, you're forcing your brain to constantly reboot. No wonder you can't remember anything. Your attention never stayed still long enough for your brain to encode anything. This isn't a personal flaw, it's a predictable neurological outcome. Let's break this down with something obvious. Imagine trying to pour water into a glass while shaking your hand non-stop. Most of the water spills out. That's exactly what happens when you try to memorize or learn while distracted. The information just spills out because nothing stays still long enough to land. Here's the second truth. Attention isn't passive. It's a skill you train. And most people have spent years training the exact opposite skill, instantly reacting to notifications, jumping at every vibration, scrolling endlessly, rewarding their brain for constant novelty instead of depth. Your attention span hasn't been stolen. You've been weakening it daily through your own habits. To improve memory, you need to rebuild attention deliberately. This starts with monotasking, one task at a time, with full presence. It's not glamorous, it's not exciting, but it's the foundation of every memory technique that actually works. Let's look at practical scenarios. When someone tells you something important, what do? Are you actually listening, or are you waiting for your turn to speak? Are you thinking about something else? Are you glancing at your phone? Most people aren't listening, they're pretending to. And then they blame their brain when they immediately forget what was said. That's not forgetting. That's a failure to pay attention in the first place. Or take studying. People highlight paragraphs, reread pages, and assume the information will magically stick. It won't. Highlighting is useless if your attention is scattered. Your brain only encodes information that it actively processes. If you're reading while tired, distracted, or rushing, you're not encoding, you're skimming. And skimming is the enemy of memory. So, what does fixing attention actually look like? It's surprisingly simple. Start by removing competing stimuli. When you're learning something important, put your phone away out of sight, not face down beside you. Your brain is hardwired to respond to even the possibility of a notification. If you know it's nearby, part of your attention is already gone. Close extra tabs. Get rid of background noise that requires cognitive processing. If you want your memory to work, you need an environment that supports focus, not fights it. Next, slow down. Your brain cannot encode information when you rush through it. Speed creates mental turbulence. If something matters, take the extra few seconds to register it fully. Repeat it in your mind. Rephrase it in your own words. Pause before you move on. Those small moments of intention make an enormous difference in memory. Rushing guarantees forgetting. Another key part of attention training is mindfulness. Not in the trendy, spiritual way people sell it, but in the raw, practical sense of staying mentally present. That means catching yourself when your mind drifts, noticing when you're zoning out, redirecting your focus deliberately. Your brain is not a wild animal you can't control. It follows your training. If you repeatedly bring your attention back to the task, you strengthen the neural circuits responsible for focus. Over time, staying present becomes easier. And here's something people never admit. Attention is physical. Your body affects your ability to focus. Poor sleep, low hydration, bad posture, and shallow breathing degrade your attention. When your body is exhausted or stressed, your focus narrows, becomes foggy, or jumps around. You can't expect sharp attention from a neglected body. Memory is a cognitive process, but it's tied directly to physical states. If you want consistent attention, fix your sleep, hydrate, and give your brain the fuel it needs. Now let's address one more uncomfortable truth. Boredom is part of the process. People lose focus because they've trained themselves to avoid anything that doesn't give instant stimulation. Real learning isn't always thrilling. Deep focus often feels slow. You need to relearn how to sit with a task, even when it doesn't light up every pleasure center in your brain. This is mental endurance. And like any endurance, you build it through repetition. When you consistently practice giving full attention to one thing at a time, your brain begins to reward you with better recall, sharper thinking, and deeper understanding. This is not theoretical. It's observable in anyone who makes this shift. The moment you stop splitting your attention, your memory improves immediately. Think of attention as the spotlight in a dark room. Wherever the spotlight shines, the brain records, processes, and stores. When the spotlight flickers, jumps, or dims, the brain captures nothing useful. Controlling the spotlight is your responsibility, not your brain's fault. To summarize the real point of this chapter, without sugarcoating it, your memory isn't suffering because it's weak. It's suffering because your attention habits are garbage. If you want a better memory, you need to treat attention like a skill and train it daily. Sit with one task at a time, remove distractions, slow down, pay deliberate attention. Practice mental presence even when it feels uncomfortable. Master your attention, and your memory will finally have the chance to do what it's designed to do. Ignore this, and no technique in the world will save you. This is the foundation. Everything else builds on it. Chapter 3. The Power of Active Recall. Most people think they're studying or learning, but what they're really doing is absorbing information passively and hoping it magically sticks. It doesn't. Reading something over and over doesn't make you remember it. Highlighting your notes doesn't mean you understand them. Watching educational videos doesn't guarantee retention. These activities feel productive because they're easy, but they're some of the weakest methods for creating real memory. If you want to remember something long-term, your brain needs to work for it. That's the core of active recall. Active recall isn't just another study technique, it's the most effective memory strategy ever discovered. Period. Decades of research confirm it works better than rereading, highlighting, summarizing, or any other passive review method. The concept is brutally simple. Instead of stuffing information into your brain, you force your brain to pull it out. That struggle, that moment of retrieval, creates the strongest memory signals you can build. Here's the psychological reality. Your brain remembers what it has been forced to recall, not what it has been exposed to. Exposure doesn't equal learning, retrieval does. When you try to remember something without looking at the source, your brain has to dig into its storage network. That digging reinforces the pathways, strengthening the memory. It's like exercising a muscle. The more you make it work, the more powerful it becomes. Let's break this down with a basic example. Think about a phone number you dial often. You might know it by heart. Why? Not because you read it somewhere. You actively recalled it multiple times when entering it. Or think about a song you've heard 100 times. You remember the lyrics because you've mentally retrieved them over and over again, even without trying. That repeated retrieval locked them in. Meanwhile, the important information you passively read in a textbook or skim online disappears within hours because you never forced your brain to practice retrieving it. Active recall turns weak memories into strong ones by repeatedly challenging your brain to pull information from storage. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You avoid it because it's harder than passive review. It exposes what you don't know. It makes you aware of your gaps. Passive studying lets you feel smart. Active recall actually makes you smart. So how do you apply active recall in real life? The simplest version is this. After you learn something, stop reading or listening and try to restate the information from memory. Don't look at your notes. Don't cheat. Just force your brain to produce the answer. If you can't remember, go back, check the information, then try again. This cycle: attempt, fail, correct, repeat, is how real learning happens. Let's say you're reading a chapter in a book. Instead of reading the whole thing straight through, break it into small sections. Read one section, then close the book and summarize what you just learned. Not word for word your understanding of it. If your summary is weak or missing details, go back and reinforce it. Then test yourself again. You'll retain exponentially more with this method than with 4 mindless rereads. If you're watching a video, pause it every few minutes and explain what you just heard. If you're trying to remember someone's name, repeat it to yourself, then recall it an hour later, then again that evening. If you're studying for an exam, use practice questions, flashcards, or write down everything you remember about a topic from scratch before checking your notes. The format doesn't matter. What matters is that your brain is actively pulling, not passively soaking. Here's something people don't realize. Active recall also strengthens understanding, not just memory. When you try to explain a concept in your own words, you expose the parts you don't fully grasp. You can identify weak spots immediately. Passive review hides those weaknesses because it gives you the illusion of familiarity. You think you know something because it looks familiar on the page. But familiarity is not mastery. It's a trap. Active recall avoids that entire problem by forcing you to confront whether you truly understand the material. Let's talk about something most people won't admit. Learning feels harder when you do it right. Active recall is mentally taxing. Your brain doesn't like effort. It loves shortcuts. It loves the comforting lie that rereading equals learning. But every time you choose the easy method, you're reinforcing weakness. Every time you choose the harder method, you're building strength. Your brain adapts to the demands you place on it. If you demand high-level recall, it evolves to meet that demand. There's another advantage to active recall that people overlook: confidence. When you rely on passive review, you never truly know what you remember. Active recall gives you certainty. When you test yourself and succeed, you know the information is solid. When you fail, you know exactly what to fix. There's no guessing, no false confidence, no surprises. And here's something even more surprising. Active recall is faster. People waste hours rereading because it feels easier. But they retain almost nothing, so they have to review again and again. Active recall takes effort, but you retain far more in fewer repetitions. It's high-intensity training for your mind. Less time, stronger results. Of course, you'll be tempted to skip it. Your brain will resist because it prefers comfort. But comfort doesn't build, memory struggle does. Active recall feels uncomfortable because it works. If it didn't challenge you, it wouldn't strengthen you. Before wrapping up this chapter, burn this into your mind. Passive learning is a memory killer. It feels good in the moment, but leaves you with nothing. Active recall is the opposite. It feels demanding, but it delivers real, lasting memory. If you're serious about improving your memory, this technique isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything that follows. Start making your brain work for information, and you'll be shocked at how much more you retain. Active recall is the difference between pretending you learned something and actually learning it. Use it consistently, and your memory will transform from unreliable to razor-sharp. Chapter 4. Spaced repetition that actually works. Most people cram information like they're stuffing a suitcase right before a flight. Everything gets shoved in at the last minute. Nothing is organized, and half of it falls out the moment you open it again. That's exactly why cram learning collapses. It feels productive because you're putting in effort, but it's one of the weakest ways to build long-term memory. Your brain can't hold on to information that's jammed in all at once. It needs strategically timed reviews. That's what spaced repetition does, and it's one of the most powerful, scientifically proven memory systems ever created. Here's the blunt truth. If you aren't spacing your learning, you're guaranteed to forget most of what you study. Not because you're bad at remembering, but because you're ignoring how the brain biologically handles retention. Your memory doesn't strengthen from intensity, it strengthens from consistency. It thrives on repeated exposure spaced out over time. One review session creates a short memory. Several well-timed reviews create long-lasting retention. To understand why spaced repetition works, you need to get familiar with something called the forgetting curve. Think of it as the brain's natural decay pattern. After you learn something, your memory of it drops quickly within hours or days, unless you interrupt that decay with a timed review. Every time you review information right before you forget it, the memory becomes stronger, more stable, and more resistant to fading. It's like reinforcing a structure at the exact moment it starts to weaken. Do this consistently, and the memory becomes incredibly hard to lose. The problem is that most people review information at the wrong times. They either cram everything in one sitting or review too frequently in a short window. Neither works long-term. Reviewing something 10 times in one day does almost nothing for long-term retention. Reviewing something 5 times over 2 weeks transforms it into a durable memory. Same number of repetitions, completely different results. Let's break this into real numbers, so there's zero confusion. A simple spacing pattern looks like this. Review the material 1 day later, then 3 days later, then a week later, then 2 weeks later, then a month later. You're essentially refreshing the memory at strategic intervals that match the brain's forgetting rhythm. If you do this, you can retain information for years with surprisingly little effort. You don't need fancy apps or algorithms to use spaced repetition, although tools like Anki or digital flashcards can automate the schedule if you want. What you need most is consistency. You need to show up and review when the schedule tells you to. People fail with spaced repetition not because it's complicated, but because they're inconsistent and impatient. They give up too quickly or try to rush the process. Memory doesn't care about your impatience. It cares about scientifically timed reinforcement. So, let's make this practical. Let's say you're trying to learn 10 key ideas from a book. Here's how most people do it. They read the chapter once, think they understood it, and move on. But 2 days later, 80% of it is gone. Instead, here's what you should do. Read the chapter once, summarize the important points using active recall, then review those summaries the next day. After that, review again 3 days later, then once more after a week. Each review strengthens the memory, making it easier and faster to retrieve the information. If you're learning vocabulary, spaced repetition is even more powerful. You test yourself on a word today, again tomorrow, then a few days later, then a week later. Each time, your ability to recall strengthens. Compare that to cramming vocabulary for an hour and then forgetting half of it by the next morning. It's not even close. Now, here's something people don't want to admit. Spaced repetition requires discipline. That's why most people don't use it. They prefer comfort-based strategies like rereading or highlighting, even though those techniques barely work. They want the illusion of learning without the effort. But if you're reading this guide, you're not here for illusions. You want results. And this technique produces results every single time, if you stick to it. Let's address a common mistake: reviewing too early. People sometimes panic when they feel like they're forgetting and then review too soon. That defeats the purpose. You're meant to review right before you forget, not while the memory is still warm and obvious. The small struggle you feel when trying to recall information is part of the strengthening process. If you remove that struggle, you weaken the effect. Another mistake people make is reviewing too much at once. They try to cram 50 flashcards or pages into one sitting and expect to retain them all. That's not spacing, that's a marathon of burnout. Spaced repetition works best when you break information into manageable chunks. Your brain prefers smaller, more frequent bursts of effort rather than one exhausting session. Here's a mindset shift you need. Spaced repetition isn't about perfection, it's about momentum. You will forget things. That's the entire point. Forgetting is a signal, not a failure. It tells you when to review. If you never forgot anything, spaced repetition wouldn't be necessary. Forgetting is part of the system. So stop getting frustrated when something doesn't stick instantly. Use the forgetting as feedback. Something else you should understand: spaced repetition doesn't just help with academics. It applies everywhere. Want to remember names? Review them on a spaced schedule. Want to memorize speeches? Break them into sections and rehearse each part over spaced intervals. Want to retain concepts, facts, or life lessons? Space your reflection and review. Anything you genuinely want to remember, long-term benefits from spacing. Before closing this chapter, let's make one thing absolutely clear. Spaced repetition isn't optional if you want a powerful memory. It's the backbone of long-term retention. You can layer visualization, active recall, chunking, or any other technique on top of it, but without spaced repetition, the memories will still eventually fade. If you're serious about improving your memory, you can't rely on one-time learning or last-minute cramming. You need to respect the timeline your brain operates on. Spaced repetition isn't glamorous, but it works every time you use it. The only question is whether you have the discipline to apply it consistently. Build this habit, and you'll turn forgettable moments into lasting knowledge. Ignore it, and you'll keep losing information that could have been yours permanently. The choice is simple. The execution is up to you. Chapter 5. Visualization and association. If you struggle to remember information, it's not because your brain is incapable. It's because the way you're trying to remember is flat, boring, and unnatural. Your mind isn't built to store raw data. It's built to remember images, stories, emotions, movement, and sensory details. That's why you can recall a random scene from your childhood, but can't remember what you read yesterday. The difference is simple. One had vivid sensory encoding, the other didn't. Visualization and association tap directly into the brain's natural strengths. If you ignore these techniques, you're working against biology instead of with it. Let's start with visualization. This isn't about being creative or having an artistic mind. It's about converting information into mental images because the brain handles images far more efficiently than abstract facts. A picture is not just worth 1,000 words. It's easier to store and retrieve because the brain's memory architecture evolved to navigate landscapes, recognize objects, track movement, and respond to visual cues. Your ancestors didn't need to memorize lists. They needed to remember where the water source was or which plants were dangerous. Your brain is still wired for that world. Visualization hijacks this system. Suppose you want to remember a name like Baker. If you try to force the word into memory as plain text, you'll probably forget it within minutes. But if you imagine that person wearing a chef's hat and holding a tray of bread, the memory sticks effortlessly. Why? Because you attach the name to a vivid mental image. You turned an abstract piece of information into something your brain actually knows how to store. This is the essence of visualization. Give the brain something it recognizes, and it will remember it. The more exaggerated, unusual, or emotionally charged the image, the better. Normal, logical images are forgettable. Absurd ones aren't. If you want to remember an item like umbrella, imagining yourself holding a normal umbrella in the rain is weak. Instead, picture a giant umbrella the size of a house, bright red, floating above you like a hot air balloon. It's impossible to forget because it violates normal expectations. The brain pays attention when reality gets weird. Now let's talk about association. Association is the glue that connects new information to something you already know. Learning becomes infinitely easier when you attach unfamiliar information to familiar anchors. This is how memory experts memorize long lists, decks of cards, names, dates, and abstract ideas. They turn isolated data into interconnected mental networks. The more connections a memory has, the easier it is to retrieve. Here's a simple example. If you want to remember that the capital of Slovakia is Bratislava, don't just repeat the fact like a boring mantra. Link it to something absurd or personal. Maybe imagine a bratwurst sausage wearing sunglasses sitting at a desk labeled Slovakia HQ. Is that ridiculous? Absolutely. But it works. The association gives your brain something to grab onto. Without it, the information is just a loose, floating fact with no anchor points. Your brain hates disconnected information, but when you tie something new to something familiar, you build a pathway. The more pathways, the easier the memory. That's why people remember stories better than lists. Stories naturally link events, characters, and objects together in a chain. Each part triggers the next. When you build associations deliberately, you're creating your own mental chains. Let's take a deeper look at why these techniques are so effective. Visualization and association activate multiple regions of the brain simultaneously: visual, emotional, linguistic, conceptual. With passive memorization, only a small part of your brain is involved. With vivid imagery, you engage a wide network. This makes the memory far more stable because it's stored across multiple systems instead of a single one. It's like having multiple backups instead of relying on one fragile file. Another benefit is that visualization forces attention. Your mind can drift while reading or listening, but it can't create vivid mental images without being fully engaged. The process demands focus, and that focus strengthens encoding. When you vividly imagine something, you're not just thinking, you're participating. And here's a critical point. These techniques work for every type of information, not just simple objects. You can visualize abstract concepts by turning them into symbols. You can visualize names, numbers, historical dates, scientific terms, languages, or processes. You can visualize habits, goals, and routines. Your imagination is a tool, not a childish distraction. Those who dismiss these techniques as silly usually have terrible memories and don't want to admit they're sabotaging themselves. Let's make this practical. Suppose you're trying to remember the parts of the brain: hippocampus, amygdala, cerebellum, and so on. Instead of memorizing the words like vocabulary, visualize each part. Picture the hippocampus as a giant hippo trying to find its way through a maze, because the hippocampus handles navigation and memory. Imagine the amygdala as a tiny alarm bell that rings every time you sense danger. Imagine the cerebellum as a little balancing robot. These images take seconds to create but last far longer than brute force memorization. Another practical example: remembering to do daily tasks. Instead of relying on reminders, create mental images. If you need to call someone after work, visualize your phone literally jumping out of your bag the moment you walk through the door. The absurdity makes the memory sticky. Now let's address a problem most people have. They think visualization is hard because they expect to see crisp images like photographs. That's not necessary. You don't need perfect clarity. You just need recognizable mental impressions. Even vague images improve memory dramatically. Don't get hung up on perfection. Focus on consistency. Memory champions use visualization and association to memorize hundreds of items, yet most people never use these techniques for basic daily tasks. Why? Not because they don't work, but because people feel too self-conscious or lazy to try. They would rather complain about having a bad memory than spend a few extra seconds constructing a mental image. That's the real issue, not ability, but effort. Here's the final truth you need to accept. Your brain is built for imagery. The more you lean into that, the stronger your memory becomes. You can't force your brain to love dry information. You have to speak its language. Visualization and association are the language of memory. Use them consistently, and you'll unlock recall abilities you never thought you had. Ignore them, and you'll keep fighting your brain instead of using it effectively. The choice is straightforward. Make information vivid and connected, or continue forgetting it just as quickly as you learn it. Chapter 6: Chunking Complex Information. If you feel overwhelmed by information, it's not because you're dumb or incapable. It's because you're trying to memorize data in the least efficient way possible, isolated, raw, and unorganized. Your brain hates that. It's like trying to carry sand with your bare hands. Most of it slips away before you get anywhere. Chunking fixes this problem by restructuring information into meaningful groups your brain can actually handle. This technique is one of the most underrated and misunderstood tools for memory improvement, yet you use it every day without realizing it. Now it's time to use it deliberately. Chunking works because your brain isn't built to hold endless individual units of information at once. Your working memory, the part of your mind that temporarily stores and processes information, can only juggle a limited number of items at any given moment. Depending on the situation, that limit averages around 4 to 7 pieces of information. Once you overload that system, everything starts slipping through the cracks. Most people overwhelm their working memory every time they try to learn something new, then blame themselves when they forget. The problem isn't your intelligence, it's your approach. Chunking turns 20 pieces of information into 5. It transforms chaos into structure. It reduces cognitive load so your brain can breathe. It's the mental version of compressing a large file into something manageable. When information is organized into chunks, your brain processes it as single units instead of dozens of random details. Let's start with an example so basic you might overlook it. Phone numbers. If a phone number was presented as 10 separate digits, 7, 3, 5, 8, 2, 1, 9, 4, 6, 0, most people wouldn't remember it. But when it's grouped into chunks like 735, 821, 9460, it becomes dramatically easier to retain. The brain isn't memorizing 10 numbers, it's memorizing 3 chunks. That's the power of chunking in its simplest form. But chunking becomes far more important and more powerful when dealing with complex information like speeches, textbooks, presentations, processes, or long-term learning. Let's say you're trying to remember the steps of a process with 12 separate actions. If you study each action individually, your working memory will collapse by step 6. But if you reorganize the 12 steps into 4 logical groups, suddenly the entire process becomes manageable. This is how experts in any field operate. They don't memorize endless details. They create categories, structures, and mental frameworks that reduce complexity. Novices drown in details. Experts navigate patterns. Chunking is also the secret behind why some people just understand things faster. They're not smarter, they're mentally organizing information while everyone else is trying to force-feed their brain random data. They're grouping, they're simplifying, they're compressing, and because of that, they retain more with less effort. Let's dig deeper into why chunking works so well. The brain is always searching for patterns. It's wired to connect information rather than store isolated pieces. When you chunk information, you're giving the brain exactly what it wants: structure. Instead of memorizing 10 unrelated facts, you're making a mental map where each fact has a place and a purpose. And once information has structure, it becomes exponentially easier to retrieve. Here's a practical exercise. Imagine you're trying to memorize a list of 10 grocery items: eggs, bread, milk, apples, chicken, rice, pasta, lettuce, yogurt, oatmeal. You could try brute force, but you'll struggle. Or you can chunk the items into categories: dairy, milk, yogurt, produce apples, lettuce, protein, chicken, eggs, grains, bread, rice, pasta, breakfast foods, oatmeal. Suddenly, the list becomes natural because it mimics how your brain thinks. You're not memorizing 10 words, you're memorizing 4 or 5 categories and filling in the blanks. This applies to every learning scenario. If you're studying a chapter with multiple concepts, break it into themes. If you're learning vocabulary, group words by meaning or context. If you're understanding a timeline, chunk it into eras. If you're giving a speech, break it into sections with their own internal logic. Chunking is flexible. It adapts to any type of information. Now, let's address something people rarely discuss. Chunking requires effort up front. You don't get the benefit by passively absorbing information. You have to think, reorganize, categorize, and connect the dots yourself. That mental work is exactly why the memory becomes stronger. When you build the chunks yourself, you encode the information more deeply. Reading chunks created by someone else is helpful, but creating your own is far more powerful. Another overlooked benefit: chunking improves understanding, not just memory. When you group related ideas together, patterns emerge. Suddenly, you see how concepts relate to each other. You understand the material instead of memorizing it blindly. This deeper comprehension reinforces memory and makes recall easier. Here's an example from learning languages. Beginners often try to memorize verbs one by one, which is painfully inefficient. Someone using chunking groups, verbs by patterns, similar endings, similar meanings, similar conjugation rules. That person learns faster, remembers longer, and makes fewer mistakes. That's the power of mental grouping. Let's take another example: public speaking. Instead of trying to memorize a 10-minute speech word for word, which is torture, break the speech into chunks: introduction, key point 1, key point 2, key point 3, conclusion. Within each chunk, you chunk again: main idea, example, summary. When you practice, your brain retrieves chunk by chunk instead of sentence by sentence. This is why professional speakers seem so natural. They're navigating through chunks, not reciting lines. Chunking also works for long-term conceptual learning. If you're learning history, divide periods into political, economic, social, and cultural themes. If you're studying science, chunk by systems or processes. The more organized your information, the more your brain cooperates. Here's the blunt truth: if you're trying to memorize everything raw, you're setting yourself up to fail. You're overloading your working memory and confusing your brain. Chunking is the antidote to overwhelm. It gives your brain a structure it can latch onto. Before wrapping this chapter up, understand this clearly: chunking is not optional. It's a foundational skill for anyone who wants a strong memory. It's the difference between drowning in information and mastering it. If you adopt this habit grouping, organizing, simplifying, you'll learn faster, remember longer, and understand deeper than the average person ever will. This technique takes you from scattered thinking to structured intelligence. Without it, you'll always feel like information is slipping through your fingers. With it, you'll finally feel in control. Chapter 7. Emotional and Environmental Anchors. If you've ever wondered why you can remember an embarrassing moment from 10 years ago but can't remember what you studied yesterday, the answer is simple: emotion. Your brain treats emotionally charged experiences like high-priority data. It stamps them with urgency. Meanwhile, neutral information like random facts or boring instructions gets tossed aside. Your memory isn't broken. It's selective. It keeps what feels meaningful and discards what feels irrelevant. Emotional and environmental anchors exploit this natural system. Once you learn how to use them, you can make almost anything stick. Let's start with the emotional side, because this is the part most people misunderstand. Emotion doesn't have to mean dramatic events. You don't need fear, heartbreak, or joy to remember something. Emotional anchoring simply means connecting information to something your brain actually cares about, something with personal relevance, significance, or impact. The more you attach feeling, purpose, or context to information, the more your brain will prioritize it. Think about names. People constantly complain about forgetting names immediately after hearing them. It's not because names are hard, it's because you don't care. You hear a name, but there's no emotional hook, no personal relevance, no meaning. Your brain labels it unimportant, so it tosses it. But if you meet someone whose name reminds you of a childhood friend, a celebrity you admire, or someone you dislike, the memory sticks almost instantly. The emotion, even if mild, creates a tag. This is the core principle. When information is connected to an emotion, the brain encodes it far more deeply. You can use that deliberately. When learning something, don't just read it, attach significance. Ask yourself, why does this matter? How does it help me? How does this idea connect to my goals, my identity, or my challenges? Even simple questions like these inject meaning, and meaning is fuel for memory. But emotion isn't the only anchor. Your environment also plays a huge role in how you remember. This is something people rarely think about, yet it affects memory constantly. If you've ever walked into a room and immediately forgotten why you went there, that's environmental context at work. The change in surroundings disrupted your mental thread. On the flip side, you've probably had moments where returning to a specific place triggered a memory so vivid it felt like the past came back to life. That's because your brain links information to the physical environment where it was learned. The environment becomes a container for the memory. This is why students often remember material better in the classroom where they learned it. It's why certain smells or songs bring back specific memories. Your brain doesn't just store information, it stores the context around the information. That context then becomes a retrieval cue later. But most people never take advantage of this mechanism. They study everywhere, review in random places, and mix environments so much that their brain has no consistent anchor to build on. If you want your memory to work for you instead of against you, you need to leverage environmental context deliberately. Use consistent locations for specific types of learning. When you're studying something important, create a dedicated space for that particular topic. Same lighting, same seating, same desk setup. Over time, your brain learns, this environment equals this information. When you return to that space, you activate the mental state connected to the material. This isn't superstition, this is context-dependent memory, a very real cognitive phenomenon that most people waste without thinking. You can also flip this technique around. If you need to recall something in a different environment, like when taking a test or giving a presentation, practice retrieving the material in multiple locations. The variety trains your brain to access the memory without relying on a single environmental cue. This is called context variation, and it's one of the most powerful ways to build flexible memory. Let's talk about sensory anchoring. Your senses are gateways into memory. Smells, sounds, textures, and even temperature can act as anchors. If you always study with a specific scent, say peppermint oil, your brain will begin associating that smell with the information. Use the same scent during a test or presentation, and your recall improves. It's not magic, it's leveraging the brain's sensory wiring. The same applies to music. If you listen to a specific playlist while learning, hearing that playlist again can revive the memory. The problem is that most people study with random noise or different genres every time, so they never build consistent anchors. Emotional and environmental anchors also help you remember tasks and routines. If you struggle with remembering daily habits like drinking water, stretching, reading, or practicing a skill, you can attach those habits to emotional triggers or environmental cues. For example, place your water bottle somewhere you can't ignore it. That's an environmental anchor. Or tie a habit to a feeling like reading every night as part of winding down. That's an emotional anchor. The more deliberate the trigger, the stronger the habit. Now let's touch on something people don't like admitting. Most information you forget didn't matter to you in the first place. Your brain filters ruthlessly. If something doesn't strike you as meaningful, it fades. When you attach emotion, purpose, or context, you override that filter. You force the brain to care. This is why you remember stories better than lists. Stories naturally contain emotional beats and environments. They give your brain structure and feeling. Lists are sterile. Facts are dry. Emotion gives them life. Environment gives them grounding. Here's an example. If you're trying to memorize historical events, don't just stare at dates. Imagine what it felt like to live in that time period. Visualize the environment, the tension, the emotions of the people involved. Attach meaning to the sequence. Suddenly, the events stop being flat numbers and become vivid mental scenes, and mental scenes stick. Another example, learning complex concepts. Suppose you're trying to understand how the immune system works. You can memorize the steps mechanically and forget them next week. Or you can imagine your immune cells as soldiers, pathogens as invaders, antibodies as weapons. You create emotional weight and imagery around the concept. That story-like framing reinforces the information because your brain treats it like a narrative instead of sterile data. Before closing this chapter, let's make something very clear. Emotion and environment aren't extra tricks. They're core components of how memory functions. People who ignore them handicap themselves. People who use them intentionally build powerful, reliable memory networks without working harder, just smarter. Emotion tells the brain what to keep. Environment tells the brain where it belongs. If you start leveraging both, your recall, comprehension, and learning speed will skyrocket. Ignore them, and you'll keep fighting a losing battle against your own biology. The smartest learners aren't the ones who grind the hardest. They're the ones who use the brain the way it was designed to operate. Chapter 8. Fixing Lifestyle Habits That Destroy Memory. If you've made it this far, you've probably noticed a theme. Your memory isn't the problem, your habits are. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the lifestyle choices people make every single day. You can practice all the fancy techniques in the world, but if your physical and mental habits are garbage, your memory will stay weak. Your brain is an organ, not a magical device, and it's completely dependent on how well you take care of yourself. Ignore this reality, and you will always hit a ceiling. Fix it. and you'll feel your memory sharpen almost instantly. Let's start with the biggest culprit: sleep. People treat sleep like an optional luxury, something they can sacrifice whenever life gets busy. That's delusional. Sleep is not a break from life, it's a biological requirement. Your brain uses sleep to consolidate memories. Everything you learn throughout the day gets sorted, organized, and transferred into long-term storage while you sleep, especially during deep sleep and REM phases. If you're consistently cutting sleep short, your brain never gets to finish the job. You're basically deleting what you just learned. Here's the harsh truth. Staying up late to study or work is one of the dumbest things you can do for your memory. You think you're gaining time, but you're actually sabotaging retention. A tired brain learns slower, encodes weaker, stores less efficiently, and retrieves poorly. You've probably experienced the mental fog, the forgetfulness, the difficulty focusing after a bad night of sleep. That's not just being tired. That's your brain malfunctioning because you didn't give it the time it needs to reset and strengthen the neural pathways responsible for memory. Fix your sleep, and you will instantly boost your memory even without trying. Aim for consistent sleep, not random hours. Go to bed and wake up at the same time. Minimize screens at night. Stop pretending you can operate normally with chronic sleep debt. You can't. Your memory suffers first. Next, we need to talk about diet. Most people underestimate how brutally their eating habits affect their brain. Your brain is a high-energy organ. It burns a massive amount of calories and requires stable blood sugar, healthy fats, and micronutrients to function properly. Yet people shovel in junk food, sugar, processed snacks, and energy drinks, and then wonder why they can't think clearly. Memory relies on neurotransmitters, chemical messengers your brain needs to form connections. Those neurotransmitters come from nutrients. If your diet is trash, your brain chemistry is unstable. And unstable brain chemistry means unstable memory. You don't need to become a nutrition expert. You just need to stop sabotaging yourself. Eat real food. Prioritize things that support cognitive health: leafy greens, berries, healthy fats, proteins, omega-3 seconds. Stay hydrated. Your brain is mostly water, and even slight dehydration reduces focus and recall. If you're constantly forgetting things, there's a good chance your energy, hydration, and blood sugar are all over the place. Now let's address stress. Stress destroys memory faster than almost anything else. When you're stressed, your body releases cortisol. In small bursts, cortisol is fine. In chronic doses, it's toxic to your hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory storage and retrieval. That's why stressed people are forgetful, scattered, overwhelmed, and mentally exhausted. It's not personality, it's chemistry. Long-term stress physically damages the brain regions responsible for memory. But here's the part people avoid. Most of their stress is self-inflicted. They don't manage their time. They multitask constantly. They overload themselves with commitments. They never take breaks. They scroll themselves into dopamine depletion. They treat their mind like a trash can and then wonder why it's malfunctioning. Reducing stress isn't optional if you want a reliable memory. And no, you don't need to meditate for hours or become a monk. You just need basic self-management, breaks, boundaries, breathing room, quiet time, and realistic workloads. Another major habit that destroys memory is constant stimulation. People think being mentally active means being mentally healthy. Wrong. Overstimulation is just as bad as understimulation. If you're jumping between apps, binge-watching videos, scrolling non-stop, or drowning in notifications, you're frying your brain's attention system. And as you learned earlier, attention is the foundation of memory. You cannot form strong memories when you're constantly bombarding your brain with dopamine hits and micro-distractions. Your mind becomes fragmented, your recall weakens, you become mentally numb. If you want better memory, you need periods of silence, stillness, and low stimulation. Let's talk about exercise next, because this is one of the most underrated memory enhancers on the planet. Physical activity increases blood flow to the brain, boosts neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, and strengthens the connections involved in learning and memory. You don't need to become a gym fanatic. Even moderate exercise, walking, stretching, light workouts has massive cognitive benefits. If you sit all day, barely move, and treat your body like a parked car, don't expect your brain to perform like a high-performance engine. Movement is fuel. Then there's posture and breathing, two things people ignore completely. Poor posture reduces oxygen flow to the brain. Shallow breathing keeps you in a constant low-level stress response. Both make focus harder and memory weaker. Sit upright. Breathe deeply. Support your brain with oxygen. It's not complicated, yet most people never do it. What about technology use? Overdependence is a silent memory killer. When you let apps remember everything for you, your brain stops bothering. Reminders, notes, saved passwords, these tools are helpful, but too much reliance weakens your natural recall. It's mental atrophy. Use technology as support, not a replacement for effort. Challenge your brain regularly so it doesn't degrade. Now let's address something most memory guides never say. Your identity impacts your memory. If you constantly tell yourself you have a bad memory, your brain listens. Behavior shapes habit. Habit shapes performance. If your self-talk is negative, your brain will act accordingly. But this isn't about affirmations or positive fluff. It's about eliminating false limitations. You don't have a bad memory. You have untreated habits. Fix those habits, and your identity will naturally shift. Before ending this chapter, it's important to understand one last thing. Memory doesn't improve in isolation. It improves when your entire lifestyle supports cognitive health. You can't separate your brain from the rest of your habits. Everything is connected. Sleep, diet, hydration, stress, movement, stimulation levels, breathing, and identity all influence memory. The people with the strongest memories aren't superhuman. They simply have brain-supporting lifestyles. If your body is exhausted, your mind will be too. If your habits are chaotic, your memory will be chaotic. If your life is overstimulated, your attention will be fried. And when attention is fried, memory collapses. Fix your habits, and your brain will finally have the environment it needs to function at full capacity. Ignore them, and no amount of memorization techniques will compensate. Memory is a biological system. Treat it with respect or pay the price. Chapter 9. Eliminating Memory Crutches. If you truly want a strong, reliable memory, you need to face a harsh but unavoidable truth. You've been outsourcing your brain for years. Every reminder, every note, every alarm, every saved password, every autofill, every "let me Google it again," and every time you rely on your phone to do the thinking for you, you weaken your natural memory. Not because technology is evil, but because your brain adapts to whatever demands you place on it. And right now, you're placing almost none. People today aren't suffering from memory problems, they're suffering from convenience addiction. They reach for digital crutches before their brain even gets a chance to try. You can't expect mental strength when you never give your mind any weight to lift. This chapter is about eliminating unnecessary memory crutches so your brain is forced to start doing its job again. Let's start with the biggest offender, your smartphone. It has become your external brain. You use it to remember appointments, birthdays, tasks, lists, addresses, names, schedules, and pretty much anything else you don't want to bother recalling. And here's the part people don't want to admit. The more you outsource to your phone, the more dependent you become. That dependency atrophies your natural memory systems, in the same way relying on crutches atrophies your leg muscles. But notice the key word, unnecessary. Technology isn't the villain here. Thoughtless overuse is. Your brain evolved to remember things. It wants to remember things. But it can't grow if you refuse to give it the opportunity. Consider something simple. Remembering a short grocery list. Most people instantly pull out their phone and type it in. They don't even attempt to visualize it, chunk it, or memorize it. Their brain never engages. That's the problem. The act of trying, even if you fail the first few times, strengthens memory. The act of avoiding effort weakens it. You don't forget because you're incapable. You forget because you've trained yourself to depend on an external system for even the simplest recall tasks. Let's make this clear. A strong memory is built through consistent mental exercise. If you're constantly dodging the exercise, you will remain mentally weak. Start small. Remember the list. Remember the name. Remember the date. Remember the directions. Remember the idea. Every time you force yourself to recall something manually, you're strengthening neural pathways. Every time you skip the work, those pathways remain weak. Now let's talk about reminders. They're not inherently bad. They're useful for things you absolutely can't afford to forget. But most people treat reminders like training wheels they never plan to remove. They set reminders for trivial, easy-to-remember things simply because it's easier than thinking. The problem isn't the reminder itself, it's the reflex. When your first instinct is to outsource instead of encode, you're giving your brain no reason to participate. Here's the truth. Your memory fails not because you forget too often, but because you practice remembering too little. Let's look at passwords. People save them automatically because it's convenient, but memorizing even a few passwords is excellent training for your brain. It forces repeated recall. It strengthens working memory and long-term storage. Yet people avoid it because they'd rather let their phone carry the load. Same with phone numbers. A generation ago, people knew dozens of numbers by heart. Now many can't recall 2 without checking their devices. That's not evolution, it's mental laziness. Even navigation has become a crutch. GPS is useful, but relying on it every single time prevents your hippocampus, the brain area responsible for spatial memory, from doing its job. People get lost easily now, not because they're less intelligent, but because they've stopped engaging the part of the brain responsible for mapping environments. If you want to improve this, turn off the GPS occasionally. Try navigating familiar routes using memory. Pay attention to landmarks. Build mental maps. Your brain will adapt quickly. Let's address something uncomfortable. People often hide behind memory aids because they're afraid of failure. They'd rather rely on Google or their notes than risk being wrong. But that fear is exactly what prevents the brain from strengthening. Your brain grows through retrieval attempts, even failed ones. Every wrong answer is part of the training process. Outsourcing prevents you from ever engaging. Another massive issue is over-documenting. Some people write everything down: ideas, tasks, reminders, plans, insights, thoughts, not because the information is too important, but because they don't trust their brain at all. They've convinced themselves they're forgetful, so they've stopped even trying to remember. This is one of the most damaging mental habits you can develop. You're not documenting because you're forgetful. You're forgetful because you're documenting everything. Write down only what truly needs to be preserved. For the rest, challenge yourself. Hold the idea in your mind. Rehearse it. Repeat it. Let your brain practice doing what it's designed to do. Let's look at conversation memory. People constantly forget what others tell them because they're not listening, and when they do listen, they rely on their phone to store the information. Instead of remembering a meeting time, they immediately add it to a digital calendar. Instead of remembering a coworker's request, they put it in a task app. Instead of remembering what their partner asked them to do, they write a note. The problem isn't the tool, it's the impulse to avoid mental effort. You can remember far more than you think if you actually pay attention and engage with the information before running to your phone. Now, let's talk about something deeper: cognitive confidence. When you rely on crutches too much, you start believing you need them, and once you believe that, your memory degrades even faster. This is a psychological, self-fulfilling prophecy. You think you have a bad memory, so you outsource more. You outsource more, so your memory weakens further. You weaken your memory, so you outsource even more. It becomes a loop of mental fragility. Breaking this loop requires intentionally removing some supports, not all, but enough to challenge yourself. Start by memorizing small things, short lists, daily tasks, names, quotes, directions, key ideas from something you read. Train your brain to function without immediate assistance. Here's the mindset you need. Your brain is not fragile, it's adaptable, but it only adapts to the demands you place on it. If you never demand recall, it never improves. Before closing this chapter, understand this clearly. External memory tools are not evil. They are useful, powerful, and sometimes necessary. But if you rely on them for everything, you're choosing convenience over capability. You're choosing weakness over strength. You're choosing mental dependency over mental competence. A strong memory isn't built by comfort. It's built by responsibility, by effort, by intention. The more you train your mind to carry information instead of outsourcing it immediately, the stronger, sharper, and more reliable your memory will become. Stop letting technology think for you. Start letting your brain do its job again. Chapter 10: Turning Memory into a Daily Habit. By now, you've learned powerful memory techniques: active recall, spaced repetition, visualization, chunking, attention control, emotional anchoring, lifestyle optimization, and eliminating crutches. But none of it matters unless you turn these skills into habits. Memory improvement isn't a one-time project. It's not a study trick. It's not something you practice only when you're preparing for an exam or trying to memorize a list. It's a daily discipline. And if you don't build that discipline, you'll slide right back into the same forgetfulness you've been battling your whole life. This chapter is about making memory a lifestyle, not a hobby. The truth is simple. Your brain adapts to whatever you repeatedly demand from it. If you demand strength daily, it becomes strong. If you demand nothing, it becomes lazy. Memory excellence isn't built through occasional effort, it's built through repeated, intentional actions. The techniques you've learned are tools, but habits turn tools into results. Let's start with the most fundamental habit: practicing deliberate recall every single day. Not for hours, not in some extreme grind, but consistently. You need daily exposure to the act of retrieving information from your brain. This could mean recalling the important points of a chapter you read, summarizing a podcast from memory instead of rewinding, or recounting a conversation instead of checking your notes. Every time you force your mind to retrieve, rather than reconsume, you strengthen the neural pathways responsible for memory. Daily recall can be simple. When you wake up, try remembering 3 things you learned the previous day. When you go to bed, summarize your day mentally. When someone tells you something important, Rehearse it in your mind before you reach for your phone. You don't need to complicate this. You just need consistency. Next, you need to apply spaced repetition on a long-term timeline. Most people fail because they treat spaced repetition as a short project. They follow it for a week, then stop. But spaced repetition is a lifestyle pattern. The reason it works is because it mirrors how the brain naturally strengthens long-term memories. Build a simple rotation of reviews. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just review yesterday's material, last week's material, and last month's material in a loose rhythm. You'll be shocked at how much you retain by maintaining even a minimal schedule. Visualization should also become second nature. Whenever you encounter new information, names, concepts, vocabulary, instructions, convert it into a mental image. Don't wait for a dedicated study session. Do it in real time. If you meet someone named Lily, picture a lily flower in her hair. If someone mentions a deadline, picture a massive clock ticking behind them. If you learn a scientific concept, build a mental story around it. The more you practice this, the faster and more natural it becomes. Eventually, you won't even notice you're doing it. It'll be your default way of encoding information. Another habit you need to build is chunking as a way of thinking. Chunking isn't just a technique, it's a mindset. Start forcing yourself to mentally organize whatever you learn into groups, patterns, frameworks, and categories. When reading, ask yourself, what's the big picture? How does this connect? What belongs together? What can I combine? This trains your brain to automatically simplify complexity. Over time, you'll stop seeing random details and start seeing structured systems. That shift alone can elevate your memory and comprehension more than any other skill. Now let's talk about the habit of attention. You need to train your brain to focus deliberately every single day. Attention is like a muscle. It gets stronger when you use it and weaker when you ignore it. Build daily habits that force you to monotask. Do certain tasks with your phone in another room. Schedule periods where you engage with one task at a time. No switching, no shortcuts. Practice listening with full presence when people speak. Practice reading without skimming. Practice watching something without multitasking. This consistent training builds the mental stamina required for high-level memory. You also need daily habits that support physical and emotional well-being. Sleep should be non-negotiable. Hydration should be automatic. Movement should be part of your routine. A stressed, tired, dehydrated brain cannot memorize effectively, no matter how many techniques you use. Take care of your body, and your brain will follow. This isn't optional, it's foundational. Next, you need to build the habit of reducing unnecessary memory outsourcing. Start small. Pick certain things you will not rely on your phone for. Small lists, basic directions, short tasks, names of people you meet, or details from conversations. Train your brain daily to remember without assistance. The more you force it to hold information, the more capable it becomes. Your brain strengthens through use. Give it something to do. Now let's address consistency, because this is where most people crumble. People love short-term enthusiasm, but hate long-term discipline. They get excited about memory improvement for a week, then forget about it. That's exactly why they never improve. Memory mastery is the result of thousands of small, consistent repetitions, not one dramatic effort. Here's the mindset you must adopt. Memory is not an event, it's a practice. You don't fix your memory, you train it. And training requires consistency. You don't need perfection, you just need daily engagement. 5 minutes of deliberate recall every day beats 1 hour of passive studying once a week. 10 minutes of spaced repetition beats cramming for hours. A few intentional visualizations throughout your day beat a long session once in a while. Memory rewards frequency, not intensity. Another habit you must develop is reflection. Reflecting strengthens memory because it reinforces what you've learned by connecting it to your personal experience. At the end of each day, reflect on what you learned, what stood out, what was new, what challenged you, what surprised you. Even a small reflection builds long-term retention because it forces you to retrieve and reorganize the information. Finally, you must build the habit of identity alignment. If you see yourself as someone with a weak memory, you will behave like someone with a weak memory. You'll avoid mental effort. You'll lean on crutches. You'll reinforce your limitations. But if you adopt the identity of someone who trains their memory, someone who practices, someone who engages mentally, someone who values recall, you will naturally behave in alignment with that identity. Identity drives behavior. Behavior builds habits. Habits build capability. Before closing this chapter, understand one final truth. Memory improvement is not a destination. It's an ongoing process. You will continue to get better as long as you continue practicing. You will slip if you stop. That's not failure, that's how the brain works. If you want a sharp, dependable memory for life, you need to integrate these techniques into your daily routine. Not perfectly, not obsessively, just consistently. A few minutes here, a few deliberate actions there, repeated over weeks and months, create transformation. Master your habits, and your memory will become one of your greatest strengths. Neglect them, and everything you've learned will fade just like anything else that isn't used. The choice is yours. Memory is built through daily practice. Make that practice part of your life, and your mind will reward you with clarity, sharpness, and reliability that most people never come close to achieving. You've reached the end of this guide, but the truth is, nothing ends here unless you let it. Memory isn't something you fix once and forget about. It's something you build, maintain, and sharpen over time. If you walk away from this book and go right back to mindless scrolling, sloppy habits, and relying on your phone to think for you, your memory will weaken again, guaranteed. Not because you're incapable, but because you're choosing convenience over growth. Everything you need to radically improve your memory is already in your hands now. You understand how memory works, how to encode information effectively, how to recall it deliberately, how to create vivid mental images, how to chunk complex ideas, how to anchor learning to your emotions and environment, how to build brain-supporting habits, how to eliminate the crutches that make you mentally soft, and how to turn all of this into a daily practice. You're no longer guessing, you're equipped. The only thing left is execution. You don't need perfect technique. You don't need superhuman discipline. You just need consistency. Small, deliberate actions repeated every day will outperform big bursts of effort, followed by long stretches of neglect. Your brain responds to what you demand from it. Demand more, and it will give you more. Treat your memory like a skill instead of a limitation, and it will grow. Most people drift through life forgetting everything they read, losing track of conversations, missing details, and blaming their genetics for it. They accept mental fog as normal. They settle for mediocrity. You don't have to. You now know better. You now have the tools and the understanding to build a memory that actually works for you instead of against you. The question is simple. Will you use them? Because if you do, even for a few minutes a day, you'll become sharper, faster, more focused, more reliable, and far more capable than the average person. You'll think better, learn better, remember better, and that advantage compounds. Your memory can be one of your strongest assets, but only if you treat it like one. This is your moment to decide whether this book becomes just another thing you forget, or the turning point where you finally start taking your mind seriously. Choose the second option. Your future self will thank you for it.